Henry A. Giroux is the author of many books, including The Violence of Organized Forgetting, Thinking Beyond America's Disimagination Machine. He currently holds the Global TV Network Chair Professorship at McMaster University in the English and Cultural Studies Department and a Distinguished Visiting Professorship at Ryerson University. Giroux is also on the board of directors for Truthout, a nonprofit organization dedicated to providing independent news and commentary on a daily basis, free from advertising and corporate backing. Welcome to the Soapbox, Henry.
Oh, it's a pleasure to be here.
Okay, Henry, I thought we could start here. In his book, Ill Fares the Land, Tony Judt remarks, and I'm quoting here, "Even in the most freedom-loving societies, freedom comes with constraints. But if we accept some limitations, and we always do, why not others? Why are we so sure that some planning or progressive taxation or the collective ownership of public goods are intolerable restrictions on liberty, whereas closed-circuit television cameras, state bailouts for investment banks too big to fail, tapped telephones, and expensive foreign wars are acceptable burdens for a free people to bear?" He goes on to say, "There may be good answers to these questions, but how can we know unless we pose them?" So I'm posing these questions to you, Henry. How did we arrive at a place where a democratic polity willingly submits to pervasive surveillance, plutocratic governance, and a national value system apparently at odds with the electorate?
I think that what Tony is getting at, and I think that what he's suggesting and what needs to be made clear, is that the crisis in politics and the crisis in economics and the crisis in basically have not been matched by a crisis of ideas. And I think that what that means is that the right has put together an enormous public pedagogy machine that leads people to believe in the most distorted understanding of what freedom is, the most distorted understanding of the role of the state, and the most distorted understanding of democracy itself and what it means to be an agent, individually and socially, in that democracy. I mean, to claim that freedom is simply about choices that people make in which they have to ultimately bear all responsibility without talking about larger systemic problems or the constraints that are imposed on different groups in different contexts is really nothing more than the swindle of fulfillment. It's basically a lie. I think that what we now find, particularly since the 1980s, are a whole series of assumptions that really give enormous power to what Tony Judt was saying, and that is that we need to understand the politics and the frameworks that are generating these kinds of assumptions that don't benefit the 99%, assumptions that don't benefit most people, but basically benefit the 1%. I mean, look, when you have a population that can barely translate private problems into larger systemic issues, what do? They say things like, or they believe in things like, well, if you're poor, it's because you believe you have bad character. If you're subject to racist violence, it's because you've invited it. If you're a young black kid running down the street and you get shot in the back, it's because you somehow are responsible for that sort of incident. And it goes on and on.
Yeah. So I wonder, Henry, to what extent the liberal class in America bears some responsibility for this, because there was the shift in the 70s from a politics of sort of collective economic freedom and material concerns to one of more sort of personal freedom and individualism. And of course, this was on the heels of the McCarthy era in the 50s, and Ellen Schrecker wrote this great book, Many Are the Crimes, about the evisceration of the left in America, often with the acceptance and encouragement by the liberal class. Doesn't that leave sort of a vacuum that allows the entire national politics to move hard to the right?
Oh, I think we've seen this since the 1970s, and I think it's epitomized by Obama. I mean, I think that liberals, that definition of liberals, they leave the room when a fight breaks out, and I think that what we've seen here are liberals who basically are enormously afraid of the right, but probably more afraid of the left, and find themselves ultimately making enormous political and ideological concessions that essentially have moved certainly moved the United States from a somewhat center progressive to a somewhat right country. So I think, of course, the left is enormously responsible for, in some way, not being able to imagine the corruption of a system politically, economically, socially, with its really sort of hair-raising authoritarian fundamentalisms, whether we're talking about militarism, whether we're talking about neoliberalism, whether we're talking about educational fundamentalism and the new attack on reason, or whether we're talking about religious fundamentalism. I think that what they often do is respond by, rather than responding by going to the heart of what the problem is, which is that capitalism is not democracy, and that, you know, we're basically on, you know, one could argue that we now inhabit an authoritarian state. I mean, they seem to think that the more that you placate the right, you know, the more the promise of solving these problems can, you know, are on the horizon. And I think that, you know, they're enormously responsible for that. But I also think that, you know, remember, I mean, liberals are not people who, they might believe in some way, you know, providing more social provisions, but they never talk about what's at the root of the system. I mean, they don't talk about sharing wealth. They don't talk about inequality and wealth and power and what that means and how it's so corrupted the system that it's impossible to in any way reform the system anymore. The system is broken. They don't believe the system is broken because basically it benefits them. And I think that what they've done is produced a language around questions of freedom and around the questions of self-interest that in many ways are kind of on the soft side of mimicking Ayn Rand. You know, they don't talk about community. They don't talk about democracy. I mean, they don't really talk about, you know, a foreign policy that's horrendous. They don't talk about the war at home, and they don't really talk about racism in ways that would suggest collective struggles and a massive rethinking of what politics means in general. I also think they don't talk about what it means to move beyond isolated struggles, you know, rooted in a kind of identity politics in which they can sort of exercise their conscience without really getting at the heart of you know, of the problems that really plague the system.
So, you know, recently Jon Stewart announced he was stepping down from The Daily Show,
Right.
and there was a big outcry, and, you know, he's seen as sort of a prominent voice of progressive liberalism, for right or wrong, in America. And I was just having this conversation the other day. Chris Hedges has criticized Stewart and Colbert and the likes for sort of hollowing out satire, dismantling satire, because for just the reasons you were saying, that they only criticize up to a point. They sort of operate within the accepted bounds, but ultimately they're not going to expose the system that is directly benefiting them. For one, is that a fair criticism, and just connecting that to liberals and liberalism? And two, do you think that people like Stewart and Colbert are aware of that, or is it that the system has sort of convinced them that that is the farthest reaches of acceptable criticism?
I wouldn't phrase the argument as an individual argument. I mean, it's not about the failings of Colbert and Stewart. It's about the failings of a system that shuts down at a certain point when it comes to a particular kind of criticism. I mean, no, you know, these are not comedians who talk about class warfare, right? Mm-hmm. I mean, these are not comedians who talk about the militarization of the state. I mean, these are not comedians who talk about the fact that, you know, we no longer live in a democracy, but really live in a softcore form of authoritarianism. I mean, this is not their language. Mm-hmm. So I don't really understand why Chris would see that as the problem. I mean, the real problem is not taking the temperature and saying what's wrong with them. The real problem is why doesn't the left take education seriously? Why doesn't it see the educative nature of politics as central to politics? I mean, it seems to me that if we can't convince people how about the problems that they now face in ways that touch their lives in a meaningful way, if we can't create alternative educational and pedagogical institutions, if we can't take the question of agency and struggle seriously, I'm not going to blame them for that. I don't expect that much more from them. Mm-hmm. So I don't view them as the problem. I mean, I love Chris. He's a friend, but I think going after them is too easy. Mm-hmm. I mean, do we really need to have another conversation about the failings of liberals in the United States? I mean, maybe we should shift the conversation to be a little more reflective and talk about the failure of the left. Well, whether we want to talk about isolated struggles often rooted in identity politics that get us nowhere, or the lack of a comprehensive vision of politics, the lack of some sort of totality, the lack of bringing different groups together, and the lack of, again, of taking education seriously as central to politics, so we can reinvent the radical imagination and in some way begin to talk about democracy in a way that really matters, a radical democracy. So those kinds of criticisms, I mean, I understand them, but I'm not sure how far they go.
And I wonder if he wasn't getting at sort of the same thing that you're getting at, which is that I think a lot of Americans would be skeptical and surprised to hear you say that we're living under a soft form of authoritarianism.
Well, let me give you an example of why they shouldn't be surprised. Mm-hmm. Princeton University, which is no center of Marxism in the United States, recently did a study in which they looked at policy over the last 50 years. And what they discovered was that 95% of all policies have nothing to do with the needs of Americans. 95%. And so Princeton, they have to do with the needs of the financial elite. No surprise to probably you and I. At the same time, they then concluded that the United States is not a democracy anymore; it's an oligarchy. You know, Citibank, as you know, Citigroup not too long ago talked about the plutonomy. They didn't use the language of class. They said there's a plutonomy of 1%. Then there's everybody else, the precariat, and that investors should really function on the 1%. That the precariat is useless. They have no money. They're not going anywhere. So you couple those kinds of analyses with the fact that you have to be a millionaire to run for Congress or the presidency or almost any major office, and then you become a slave to lobbyists. I mean, the writing is kind of on the wall, don't you think? I mean, it's very difficult, I think, today in some way not to miss these flashpoints. So the real question is, how do we organize movements that make those flashpoints comprehensive and bring them together in a way that indicts the system outside of liberal rhetoric, that goes beyond liberal rhetoric?
Well, that's a great question. I mean, President Barack Obama wrote in one of his books of being a senator and how spending time raising money and being around lobbyists ultimately corrupted his perspective and removed him from the concerns of real American citizens, average American citizens. And yet, so he claimed that this was a motivation to run for office, and then he became president and clearly has abandoned working people, or maybe that's too harsh. You tell me. But
to abandon, that's too light. Are you serious? I mean,
you're the guest, so I need you to make these points, not me.
Yeah, I mean, here's a guy who it seems to me has infinite tolerance for bankers, for the hedge fund managers, bails them out, and has zero tolerance for working class people who have lost almost everything as a result of the recession, particularly poor minority groups. So to talk about his concern for the poor, remember, this is a guy who put through a health program in which benefited the insurance companies. That did nothing around a public health program. I'm in Canada. I can go to any doctor I want. I don't pay anything. I have surgeries. I don't pay anything. We have a national health plan. I mean, here's a guy who promoted a foreign policy in which he has a kill list. I mean, here's a guy who, at some level, has put in jail whistleblowers while he exonerates people who tortured people. I mean, I find it difficult in that kind of liberal discourse to understand almost anything about him that could possibly name him as somebody being sensitive to the needs of working people, or even sensitive to what it might mean to live in a democracy. I mean, on educational policy, he's worse than Bush. On surveillance, he's worse than Bush. I mean, and we can go on and on. This is now becoming an old story. He's going to go down as one of the most discredited presidents in the history of the United States, given the promise that people initially had in him. The contradiction between what he offered in terms of that idealistic rhetoric and what he served up is the difference between Muhammad Ali. It's like Muhammad Ali fighting a blind guy.
Well, I wonder, I agree with what you're saying, but I wonder, polls still show that Democrats are largely in support of Obama, and he has plenty of very vocal defenders, both in the media and just in social media. What is it that these people aren't seeing? And is it sort of this incrementalist argument of, the Obamacare was a foot in the door and towards nationalized health care, and
I think they Eric. I think they see a couple of things. I mean, at one level they see a right that's completely now inhabited by extremist psychopaths, people like Ted Cruz, Rand Paul. I mean, these are people who believe in creationism.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, these are people who don't believe in reason. I mean, they believe that 6,000 years ago men walked on the earth with dinosaurs. You know, and this is what they call, and this is what they project as leadership. And they, of course, they want to completely eviscerate the social contract in any way possible. And so I think that Obama's rhetoric, even in its legacy, seems somewhat reasonable, you know, compared to them. I think the other side of this is that they just don't have a language outside of liberalism. I mean, we live in a country in which it's almost impossible for people who are real progressives, people on the left, I mean, people who believe in the possibility of a different political system, people who don't equate capitalism with democracy, to really get a hearing. I mean, you know, C. Wright Mills was not wrong when he said if you really want to turn a country into a fascist country, what you do is you control the cultural apparatuses. Mm-hmm. And then what you do is you frame the discourse in a very limited, narrow way. And I think that one of the things that I've seen as somebody who was born shortly after Lincoln died over the years is that it's gotten worse. I mean, the degree to which, you know, people are now controlled enormously, their frames of references are so limited by virtue of this apparatus. You know, the mainstream media, the press, it goes on and on. Although there are openings, thank God, with the new media and the new technologies have provided. But I think that there's simply no alternatives for them. I mean, I think it's difficult to think outside of established discourses. In those established discourses, you know, Obama, who is center right, doesn't look as bad as these incredible extremists, the likes of which we haven't seen before, who are now on the other side, who basically want to destroy the United States and are actually now, buying planes and airfields in New Zealand, so when the world comes to an end, can somehow think they can escape there. I mean, you remember, we live in a country now in a world in which power is separated from politics. Politics is local, power is global. And so that global elite, they don't care about the social contract anymore. They don't make political concessions. Capitalism has produced a theater of cruelty unlike anything we've ever seen before. And I think Obama has a kind of genteelness, about him that people sort of see as it doesn't have the hard edges. It seems reasonable. But the fact of the matter is, these two parties are bought and sold. Chris Hedges has everybody's done enormous work on this who matters. I mean, they're indebted to the lobbyists. I mean, they're bought and sold. Do you really believe that Hillary Clinton, given the money that's going to come from the financial elite to support her candidacy if she became president, would in any way reverse these policies? I mean, we no longer live in a democracy. We live in a country in which the state has now been taken over by corporate interests. And I think that's the great crime of what it means to believe in Obama individually. It's not about him. It's about the structural reconfiguration of a society that no longer is in the hands of the people.
I don't really understand how, Henry, we have become so credulous as a people, such that we believe that Hillary Clinton, who has had Secret Service protection for over 20 years, can be a person of the people. I mean,
I know. It's such a good question. I mean, Eric, what it suggests to me is the enormously hard work that has not been done when you believe that the only form of domination is primarily economic and not pedagogical and intellectual. Mm-hmm. Do you understand what I'm saying? Mm-hmm. I mean, if we can't change people's consciousness, there's no hope here. Because, I don't believe in vanguards, and I don't believe you do. Mm-hmm. And I think that democracy has to arise from people. It has to arise from a sense that something's wrong. There has to be an attempt to be able to educate people in a formative culture that allows them to be able to analyze the problems in which they find themselves. And it has to be space for them to come together. I mean, I think that the public spheres that do that have been under attack since the 1980s in a way unlike we've ever seen before. Public schooling, public goods, any notion of the common good, these have all been eviscerated. And so there's no space for people to basically be exposed and to articulate that kind of alternative sort of understanding of the world in which they live. So Hillary Clinton gets reduced to being a woman, right? Mm-hmm. Right? Oh, she's a woman, Well, we need a woman in the White House. Well, they used to say that about how we need a black on the Supreme Court, and look what they got. Mm. Instead of thinking about politics, they got Clarence Thomas, who is like an abomination, when it comes to anything progressive around civil rights, or for that matter, anything else.
Well, and that's an example of how the left has sort of been defanged, I think,
Yes.
in this country, and they focus on these politics of personality as opposed to broader collective concerns, but they seem to be doing it so quiescently.
Yes.
And, Steve Fraser just wrote this great book, The Age of Acquiescence, about the two Gilded Ages. And in spite of the current Gilded Age that we're living through now being in some measures worse than the first Gilded Age, there's a stark difference, and that is that the first Gilded Age gave rise to a number of populist movements against the capitalist order.
Right, exactly.
And in this age, people seem to be acquiescing. And one of the reasons he suggested as a possibility is that the first Gilded Age happened close enough to sort of the adoption of capitalism that people came from and could still imagine a world outside of capitalism. But now, of course, as you've alluded to, capitalism has become synonymous with democracy and freedom.
Yes.
What is the problem with that?
Well, the problem with that is it distorts the notion of both democracy and freedom. That's the problem. I mean, when you claim that capitalism is democracy, you seem to suggest that the people who have power and who run the country are basically all of us. It completely disregards the massive gap in inequality in power and wealth that now exists, that has undercut and ruined almost any possibility for a politics that is some way responsive to people's needs, and it's basically controlled by people in ways that suggest that there is some sort of hope for them to have some sort of control and shape and being able to determine their own lives. And I think that this. In the past, it's interesting because there were workers, there were unions, right? There were communist parties, there were socialist parties, and regardless of what you think of these groups, they begin with a fundamental question. What does justice mean in a democracy? Mm-hmm. How do you talk about a just society? Today, when you talk about citizenship, you think about consumerism, that the only obligation of citizenship is consumerism. And I think that we've so shut down the conversation and we've so eviscerated those public spheres that make these groups, the growth of these groups, possible. We've so denuded the language with the language of advertising that it becomes very difficult to imagine a different politics. But I want to say one thing in relation to his book, mm-hmm. Fraser's book. And I think Naomi Klein actually got it. In a review she just did in the New York Times of this book. Mm-hmm. And she, like everybody else, I like the book. I think it's an interesting book, and I think the point is absolutely crucial about the kind of resistance that marked the first Gilded Age. But what he misses is that there are movements today. Mm-hmm. The Black Lives Movement, the environmental mm-hmm. movement, he barely touches any of these. And so in the end, you come away with a language of critique that is completely divorced from any language of possibility. Mm. And so, one has to argue to what degree does that become illuminating, but in the end, shut down any possibility for people realizing that, domination is not the only essence of power. Mm. Right? That there are struggles. You kidding? In light of Ferguson? Mm-hmm. In light of the uproar over police brutality? In light of the Occupy movement with its emphasis on inequality and the 1% in which they changed the language? The Quebec student movement, which was one of the most important student movements, in my estimation, in the history of the world. Mm. What's going on in Paris, in France, in Athens, Podemos, Cirrus? Yeah. Come on. Those narratives are interesting historically, but to shut down the very notion of politics by virtue of claiming to indict it, that raises a different set of questions, don't you think?